From tragic backstories that made us all cry to heartbreaking deaths that changed everything, these are the saddest moments of each One Piece arc. Also, to make things more interesting, I'm going to go through the arcs randomly, so you'll never know which sad moment comes next. With that said, let's start with one moment that I'm sure absolutely broke most of us. Arlong Park. Before Arlong Park, Nami was a character we didn't really know much about. She was very distant and sometimes even felt a bit different from the rest of the Straw Hats, which was why, when she betrayed the crew, we were ready for it. However, we weren't ready for her reasons. You see, during Arlong Park, we learned that every berry she stole and every crew she betrayed was all for one reason: to buy back her town from the Arlong pirates. Despite all of her efforts to save 100 million berries, Nami learned the bitter truth that Arlong had never planned to free the town in the first place. In an instant, all of her hopes and dreams came crashing down, leaving her completely broken inside. She hated herself at this moment. But more than anything, Nami hated Arlong's mark burned onto her arm. So she started stabbing it over and over again, furious at herself for letting her village down. Just when she had lost all hope, the Straw Hats arrived to rescue her. The moment Nami looked at them, all the emotions that she had been hiding finally came out, and for the first time in so long, she pleaded for Luffy to help her. Luffy didn't say a single word and quietly placed his straw hat on Nami's head. He then signaled his crewmates to follow him and tear down the whole Arlong Park to avenge their precious navigator. However, not every sad moment revolves around villains. Sometimes, the most heartbreaking moments happen between the crewmates themselves. Water 7. By the time Water 7 rolled around, the Straw Hats had already formed a solid bond with each other, and all the crewmates seemed inseparable at this point. But then came a breaking point. You see, over the course of their adventure, their ship, the 𝐿 had been severely damaged. So the crew decided to use all the gold they had to fix her up. But they soon learned from the shipwrights that the 𝐿 was beyond repair, and that it would be best to buy a new ship instead. When Usopp learned about this, he became angry and asked Luffy if he was really going to abandon their ship just because a stranger told them that it couldn't be fixed. Luffy tried to explain to Usopp that it was a tough decision for him, but Usopp didn't want to listen and challenged Luffy to a fight to decide the 𝐿's future. One of the reasons Usopp went so far was because this ship was a gift from his childhood friend and love interest, Kaya, which was why it held more value for him than for anyone else in the crew. Luffy accepted the duel and defeated Usopp in a fair battle, with Usopp deciding to leave the crew afterward. After this fight, Luffy shed tears for the first time in the series, as he didn't expect that he would ever have to fight one of his own friends. Zoro comforted Luffy and told him that it was his duty as the captain, and no matter how heavy his heart felt, they had to continue forward. And although the next moment we're going to cover is much shorter, doesn't make it any less sad. Reverse Mountain. You see, as soon as the Straw Hats entered the Grand Line for the first time, they met Crocus, a man who had been living inside a whale, Laboon, for a very long time. We then learned that Laboon was once a companion of the Rumbar pirates who found him when he was only a baby. Since Laboon always looked lonely, the Rumbar pirates often tried to cheer him up by singing. However, when the crew entered the Grand Line, they decided to leave Laboon behind since he was just a baby. Still, they promised to come back for him. And so Laboon held on to that promise for over 50 years, hoping that his friends would one day return, not knowing that they were already long gone. Over time, Laboon also started bashing his head against the Red Line because he still believed that his friends were on the other side, waiting for him to come to them. There are still 19 sad moments left to cover, and let's continue with one that cemented Enies Lobby as one of the best arcs in the story. Although this is the saddest moment of the Enies Lobby arc we're talking about, to better understand it, we have to go back to the point when Robin willingly surrendered herself to CP9 during Water 7. She did this because she was worried that she might become a burden to the Straw Hats and didn't want anything to happen to them. You see, when Robin was just 8 years old, she already had a bounty of 79 million berries on her head. To survive in the harsh conditions of the sea, Robin could only join various pirate crews. But each time they learned that she was the devil child of Ohara, they would betray her and try to sell her to the world government. After being betrayed so many times, Robin's heart had become ice cold, and she stopped trusting anyone. However, after joining the Straw Hats, Robin felt a sense of belonging, and her bond with them grew stronger. So, after the Straw Hats learned why Robin had left the crew, they decided to attack the Tower of Justice and bring her back, even if it meant going to war against the entire world. Robin was shocked by this, as it had been so long since someone had actually cared for her. So, when Usopp finally burned down the world government flag, Robin understood that she had made a huge mistake and that she should never have left the crew. It was here that Luffy told her that if she wanted them to save her, he needed to hear it from her. And that's where Robin finally crumbled back into being that 8-year-old girl and told the Straw Hats her honest feelings. I want to live. That single moment was enough for the Straw Hats to risk everything for her. Even after being pushed to their limits and battered through countless battles, they refused to give up and ultimately succeeded in bringing Robin back home. Post-NES lobby arc. Right after the crew rescued Robin, CP9 called in backup. Before the Straw Hats could even recover, an entire fleet of Marines arrived alongside several Vice Admirals, completely trapping the crew. Their only chance of escape was to break through the blockade and flee to the sea. But there was one problem. The 𝐿_MERY, the ship they considered their home, was no longer capable of sailing. However, just as all hope seemed lost, something impossible happened. Somehow, the 𝐿_MERY arrived on its own without anyone piloting it and rescued the crew one final time. The ship carried the Straw Hats safely away from the Marines, giving its crew one final voyage. However, soon after, the 𝐿_MERY finally began to fall apart for good. So, Luffy and the others gave the ship a Viking funeral and set it ablaze. Before sinking to the bottom of the sea though, 𝐿_MERY spoke out to the crew. It apologized for no longer being able to carry them and tearfully thanked them for all the adventures they took her on. Okay, but let's now go back to the beginning, to the arc that started it all. Romance Dawn. Long before Luffy ever set sail, Shanks was a rising star on the seas. A guy so skilled that he dueled the world's strongest swordsman, 𝗲𝗏𝗄 on an equal footing. Then, one day, during one of his visits to Luffy's hometown, he befriended the goofy kid. At first, Luffy thought Shanks was a loser, since the man wouldn't even fight back against a few measly mountain bandits. However, when those same bandits kidnapped Luffy, Shanks stood up and finally showed him just how strong his crew really was. The mountain bandit was so terrified that he grabbed Luffy as a hostage and fled to the sea to save his own skin. Once they were far enough out, the bandit threw Luffy overboard, and Luffy couldn't swim because of his devil fruit powers. To make matters worse, a sea king suddenly emerged from the water and lunged at him with its jaws wide open. But just in time, Shanks appeared and pushed Luffy out of the way. Although the kid survived, it came at a cost, as Shanks lost his arm in the process. Even though Luffy screamed and cried, blaming himself for what happened, Shanks just smiled and told him it was only an arm and that it was a low price to pay for saving Luffy's life. Alabasta. Alabasta was easily one of the most impactful arcs before the time skip, with so many epic and emotional moments. But the moment I think hit us all the hardest was the one at the very end. You see, by this point, Vivi had accompanied the Straw Hats ever since they entered the Grand Line and had pretty much become an official crewmate. I mean, she literally fought a life and death war alongside them, and they all even put a crossmark on their arms to symbolize their friendship. So, after the war was over, everyone thought Vivi would finally join the crew. But reality was different, and it gave us one of the most heartbreaking farewells in the series. With the kingdom saved, the Straw Hats were now fighting against time as Marine ships closed in on the kingdom. They waited for Vivi on the shore, but ultimately had to set sail when she didn't manage to arrive on time. Just moments after they set sail, Vivi managed to make it to the shore, and the crew happily started turning around. However, Vivi stopped them, saying that she was only there to bid them farewell. She explained how she truly loved her kingdom and wanted to help it recover and prosper. And because of that, she couldn't come with them. With tears in her eyes, she continued and asked them if they were ever to meet again in the future, would they still consider her their friend? Hearing this, Luffy jumped to answer, but Nami quickly stopped him. You see, by this point, the Marines were already too close, and if their connection to Vivi became known, it would only bring more trouble for her. Bound by these circumstances, they had no choice but to leave in silence, leaving Vivi with a frown. However, just as they were getting out of sight, Luffy and the rest of the crew raised their arms together to show Vivi the friendship mark they had all made earlier. With no words spoken, Vivi got the message and broke down in tears. Impel Down. As you already know, this arc started with Luffy breaking into Impel Down, the most secure prison in the world, in order to free his brother. Inside the prison, Luffy met a lot of new friends and also some old ones like Bon Clay, whom he hadn't seen since Alabasta, where he sacrificed himself to save Luffy from the Marines. Little did we know that this exact guy would become the GOAT of this arc. Hell, maybe even the GOAT of the entire series. You see, the first thing he did was save Luffy from the freezing hell after he was defeated by Magellan. He dragged Luffy for hours, and despite the cold, he never stopped until he brought him to Ivankov, where Luffy was eventually healed. But by the time Luffy recovered, Ace had already been transferred to Marineford. So everyone had to get out of the prison as soon as possible, and the one who made that possible was, once again, Bon Clay. Using his devil fruit, Bon Clay disguised himself as Magellan and ordered the Marines to open the gates, which allowed everyone to escape. But by doing so, he had to stay behind. When Luffy learned about his heroic sacrifice, he quickly asked Jinbei to turn the ship back, but Jinbei told Luffy that it was impossible because doing that would only make Bon Clay's sacrifice meaningless. Despite this, Luffy still wanted to go back and save his friend, but then the Den-Den-Mushi rang. Bon Clay was on the other side, and he simply told Luffy to forget everything and go rescue his brother. And while we're on the topic of heartbreaking sacrifices, we have to cover Marineford next. Marineford was the ultimate culmination of everything One Piece had been building toward before the time skip, which is why so many fans consider it one of the greatest arcs in the entire series. However, it was this exact arc that also had by far the saddest death in the series. You see, Ace's character was extremely tragic. Despite being the son of the Pirate King, Ace hated his lineage and despised his dead father, constantly running away from this. Ace eventually found a family with the Whitebeard pirates and, of course, his brother Luffy. So, when they all came to rescue him together, we all thought he might actually walk out of there alive. They even managed to remove his chains at one point, and Ace was so close to being free. Then, Akainu appeared. Knowing Ace's admiration for Whitebeard, Akainu started calling Ace's captain a failure, mocking him for not being able to become the king. Overwhelmed by his emotions and by all the sacrifices the Whitebeard pirates had made to rescue him, Ace couldn't control himself and fell right into Akainu's trap. By the time Ace realized it, it was already too late. Akainu had already turned his attention toward Luffy, who was too exhausted to defend himself. So, in that instant, Ace made his choice. Without hesitation, he threw himself between his brother and Akainu, suffering a mortal wound in the process. Before dying, Ace asked Luffy to listen to his final message and relay it to his crew. He simply thanked them all for loving him, despite being a screw-up and carrying Roger's blood in his veins. Then, he finally collapsed, dying with a smile on his face. And although all of these moments so far have been incredibly sad, there are still 13 more left to cover, and the ones near the end completely broke me. Fishman Island. Fisher Tiger's flashback is one of the most tragic backstories in One Piece. It was one of the rare times when One Piece dealt with serious topics like racism, slavery, and their consequences on society. However, the saddest part of this whole flashback wasn't Tiger himself, but a human child. You see, Koala had lived her entire life as a slave in Marioa, and she would have died there if Fisher Tiger hadn't come to free the slaves. Despite being a human, Tiger allowed her to stay on his crew, planning to eventually return her to her hometown. However, the other fishermen weren't so open-minded and despised having a human on board. So they harassed her and even beat her multiple times. But despite all of this, Koala kept smiling and even started wiping her own blood from the deck so they wouldn't have to do it. After all, the girl had been a slave for most of her life, and the only thing she knew was how to smile and follow orders, as anything else meant certain death. Jinbei, who was watching this from the sidelines, couldn't help but step in, as he was shocked to see a child in such a state. He kneeled beside her and asked her why she was so afraid that they would kill her. Koala, while continuing to smile, replied to Jinbei that she didn't want to die because she still wanted to see her mother. So, she begged them to spare her life and promised that she would be useful to them. Jinbei was unsure of what to do, so Fisher Tiger stepped in himself and branded Koala with the mark of the Sun Pirates, symbolically freeing her from slavery and taking her in as one of their own. When Koala woke up, she was terrified and immediately started begging for her life again. Even though Fisher Tiger didn't like humans, his heart broke seeing this shattered child. He promised Koala that no one would kill her on this ship, and that she was free to cry as much as she wanted. Hearing those words, Koala's fake smile faded, and she burst into tears for the very first time. Drum Island. Drum Island was definitely one of the saddest arcs in One Piece. But there was one moment that I think we can all agree made us cry the most, and that was Dr. Hiriluke's speech. This entire story started with Dr. Hiriluke finding an injured reindeer who had been cast out by his herd. The reindeer was Chopper, who basically became Dr. Hiriluke's adopted son. However, everything changed for them once Chopper learned that his father suffered from a terminal illness. So, wanting to help the one person in the world who cared for him, Chopper started his search for a magical mushroom he thought could cure the doctor. He eventually found it, but unbeknownst to him, the mushroom was actually poisonous. Once Chopper arrived back to 𝐿, he was visibly injured with a broken antler and dragging his left leg. Moved by Chopper's efforts to help him, 𝐿 decided to eat the mushroom anyway, despite knowing it was poisonous. He then delivered his legendary speech, telling everyone on the island that death wasn't the end, and that a man doesn't die when he is killed. He dies when he is forgotten. He then shouted to the heavens that he had had a wonderful life and thanked Chopper for all of it. Not wanting Chopper to feel responsible for his death, 𝐿 willingly drank a bottle of poison, causing him to die in a huge explosion, leaving only his hat behind. PARADIS. Long ago, when Sanji was still a 7-year-old kid, he worked on a cruise ship as an apprentice cook. Sanji always had this dream of finding the All Blue, which was said to be heaven for all cooks on the sea. One day, Sanji was working as usual when suddenly their ship was attacked by the cook pirates led by Red Leg Zeph. Sanji was terrified of dying before fulfilling his dream, so he picked up a knife to protect the ship on his own. But against pirates, a kid could only do so much. After looting the ship, the pirates were about to leave when a violent storm suddenly struck, and Sanji was thrown into the sea. Even though Zeph had only just met him, he still jumped into the sea to save the boy. But his efforts were futile, and the waves swept them both to a deserted island. With no hope of rescue and only a limited amount of food left, Zeph split the supplies into 2 bags. A smaller one for Sanji and a larger one for himself. Sanji was furious and wanted justice, but Zeph kicked him aside and told him to never come to his side of the island again. So, for the next 70 days, Sanji survived on whatever little food he had in his small bag. But eventually, even that tiny bit of food ran out. Hungry, angry, and desperate, Sanji decided to go back to Zeph and take more food. So Sanji approached Zeph's bag and ripped it open, only to find treasure inside. It was here that Sanji realized the truth. Zeph had already given him all the food they had. The only reason Zeph had survived up until that point was because he ate his own leg. Sanji couldn't understand why Zeph would ever do something like that for him. But Zeph's answer was simple. It was because they both shared the same dream, finding the All Blue. 𝐶𝐈𝐴. 𝐶𝐈𝐴 was one of those arcs that you either loved or hated, but one thing everyone could agree on was that the tale of Ṋoland the Liar was one of the saddest stories in One Piece. The tale went something like this. There was this man, Ṋoland, who was an explorer at heart. He loved to travel by sea, and he had even traveled through the Grand Line 3 times in his life. In one of those instances, Ṋoland ended up on Jaya. There, he killed one of the giant snakes that the locals worshipped as gods in order to save a girl. This enraged the locals because to them, Ṋoland hadn't saved anyone. He had just doomed their people by angering the gods. The tribe's greatest warrior, 𝐾𝐲𝐿, even attempted to continue the sacrifice ritual, but Ṋoland stopped him. He then convinced 𝐾𝐲𝐿 that the sickness spreading through their village was nothing more than a natural disease, not some divine curse. In the end, 𝐾𝐲𝐿 gave Ṋoland one chance to prove himself, and Ṋoland succeeded by destroying the source of the disease and saving the village. Realizing Ṋoland was right all along, 𝐾𝐲𝐿 became deeply grateful to him, and the two quickly grew into close friends. While on Jaya, Ṋoland even discovered a city of gold there called Shandora. Before leaving, Ṋoland promised that one day he would return. However, that reunion never happened. You see, shortly after Ṋoland left, Jaya was launched into the sky by the Knockup Stream and became a part of 𝐶𝐈𝐴. Later, Ṋoland returned to Jaya with his king to show him the city of gold, but there was nothing there anymore. Thinking that Ṋoland had made everything up, the king branded him a liar and sentenced him to death. However, even at his execution, Ṋoland wasn't angry or afraid. He was only worried about his friend 𝐾𝐲𝐿 and wondered what could have happened to him and his island. Another really heartbreaking flashback happened during the Thriller Bark, the Rumbar Pirates backstory. As you already know, 50 years ago, before the new age of piracy, the Rumbar Pirates met a young whale whom they named Laboon. From there, Laboon followed the crew like a curious child and quickly became one of their best buddies. After leaving Laboon near Reverse Mountain, the crew promised to come back for him and continued their journey. Things were going well until one day, the ship was ambushed by an enemy crew who used deadly poisonous weapons to injure all of the Rumbar pirates. A lot of them died on the spot, while the remaining ones were left to die a slow and painful death. The crew knew that their deaths were imminent, so they decided to pass away doing what they loved the most, making music. Before starting, they also set up a tone dial so they could record their last performance in the hopes that Laboon would hear it one day. As the acting captain, Brook played the piano, and the rest of the crew sang along and danced to its melody. One by one, the crew members fell to their deaths. First, it was a quartet performance, then a trio, then a duo, until, in the end, only Brook's solo performance was left. As Brook took his last breath, he promised Laboon that one day he would return to him. Sabaody Archipelago. The crew originally arrived on this island just to get their ship coded and prepared to enter the new world. However, what followed was something they never expected. You see, soon after docking, they heard about a human auction house. There, they witnessed the cruelty of the world nobles for the first time. Enraged by their actions, Luffy punched one of the celestial dragons, which sent the whole island into chaos. The Marines immediately dispatched Admiral 𝐾𝐶𝐟 along with Kuma to wipe out every pirate on the island. And despite how strong the Straw Hats had become throughout their journey, they were completely outmatched. Kuma started effortlessly defeating the Straw Hats and making them disappear with his abilities. He started with Zoro, then Brook, then Nami, until only a few of the Straw Hats remained. Thinking that his friends were actually dead, Luffy desperately tried to stop Kuma from killing the rest, but his efforts were futile. So, Luffy was left completely broken on the ground, with no will left inside him to fight anymore. For the first time in his life, Luffy felt absolute despair and started questioning his goal of becoming the Pirate King. Post-war. The post-war arc was a short one, but it was one filled with grief. Although the main theme of this arc was Luffy processing the death of his brother, the saddest moment, for me at least, was something else entirely. It was actually the moment when Ďaďan confronted Garp after he returned to Fuchsia Village. Although Ďaďan may not have been Ace's biological mother, she still raised him and Luffy as her own sons. She fed them, protected them, and was there for them when no one else in the world was. So when Garp returned to Fuchsia Village after the war, Ďaďan immediately hit him with her bat and asked him why he didn't save Ace. She continued to beat him up while asking the same question, but Garp stayed silent. The scene was incredibly tragic, as deep down, Garp knew that Ďaďan was right and that he could have indeed saved Ace. After all, he was Monkey D. Garp, the hero of the Marines, a man powerful enough to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Pirate King himself. What made this moment even more heartbreaking was the fact that Garp wanted someone to beat him up. After all, he chose his role as a Marine over saving his own grandson. Ironically, Roger was the one who entrusted Ace to Garp, believing that Garp was the only one in the world capable of keeping him safe. Only 6 more moments are left to cover, and I saved the best for last because from here on out, each one made us cry like little kids. Zoe. When it comes to Zoe, the saddest moment in this arc wasn't really a moment. It was literally a single sentence. However, to understand the weight of that single sentence, we need to look at the whole Zoe arc and the immense pain and suffering the Mink tribe went through. You see, Jack arrived on Zoe sometime before the Straw Hats did, and he only had one goal in mind: to find a ninja named 𝐸. Jack suspected that he might be hiding there, so he started killing and torturing many civilians in order to learn 𝐸's location. Despite them pleading with Jack that they had never heard of 𝐸 before, they had to endure Jack's wrath for 10 whole days. After finally realizing that 𝐸 might not actually be there, Jack decided to retreat, leaving many Minks dead, injured, poisoned, and their island completely ruined. However, when Kinemon arrived with the Straw Hats, we got one of the biggest plot twists in One Piece, with Inuarashi proudly telling him that 𝐸 is safe. It was that single sentence that completely shocked both us as viewers and the entire Straw Hat crew. And to top it all off, every single Mink on the island knew about it. They collectively decided to endure so much pain, suffering, and death in order to save one person they respected. Whole Cake Island. Sanji's past with Zeph was already heartbreaking, but Whole Cake Island revealed an even deeper wound: his abusive home. So, after finally finding freedom with the Straw Hats, Sanji was dragged back once again when his father threatened Zeph's life. With no way out, Sanji agreed to return home and enter a political marriage with Big Mom's daughter. When Luffy learned about this, he made a quick decision to rescue him, even if it meant offending an emperor. However, Sanji didn't want the crew to throw their lives away for him, so he refused to return. Not only that, but to completely sever his relationship with the crew, Sanji even beat up Luffy. But Luffy still refused to give up. He told Sanji that if he didn't return, he would just stay there on the island and starve to death. Because without Sanji's cooking, he couldn't become the Pirate King. Those words cut straight through Sanji's heart, because no matter how broken, hopeless, or beaten down Luffy became, he still had absolute trust in his crewmates and wouldn't give up on them. Later on, Sanji learned the truth. Big Mom never intended to spare him or his family. The promises he had placed his faith in were nothing but lies. In that moment, he realized how foolish he had been for expecting an emperor to keep her word. And worst of all, he had almost abandoned his closest friends because of it. So, despite everything he had done, Sanji found himself turning back to his crewmates once again. He realized just how much he had truly hurt Luffy and wondered if he would ever forgive him. So, he decided to pack a lunch for Luffy and take it to him. Once Luffy smelled Sanji's cooking, his stomach started to growl. He quickly grabbed the box from Sanji and started eating like there was no tomorrow. Sanji told him that the food was dirty because he had dropped it multiple times on the way there, but Luffy didn't care because it was Sanji's cooking, and Sanji's cooking was the best. This sight shattered Sanji's heart, so he finally dropped the act and told Luffy that he wanted to return to the Sunny. Wano. For years, Yasui had been preparing for the rebellion against Kaido and Orochi. However, just before it was about to begin, the information leaked. And as one of the people connected to the rebellion, Yasui was arrested and was going to be executed soon after. But before his execution, Yasui decided to use his last moments to confuse Orochi and save his fellow revolutionaries. He told Orochi that it was all just a prank and that the crescent moon, which was a symbol of the rebellion, was actually a completely unrelated design. And although Yasui's death was a tragic end to his tale, what was truly tragic and heartbreaking was the reaction of his people. Instead of crying at his execution, all they could do was laugh, as the smile fruits had robbed them of every emotion except their ability to smile. Even Yasui's daughter, Toko, who had just lost her father, couldn't do anything but laugh uncontrollably as tears streamed down her face. However, it didn't stop there, because what made this scene even more tragic was the fact that Toko tried to heal Yasui by applying toad oil to his wounds, the same oil that Usopp had sold to her, falsely claiming that it could heal everything. For the first time in his life, Usopp truly felt regret for his lies, but no matter how much regret he felt, he could never return the young girl's father to her. Punk Hazard. Even though Marines are usually the bad guys in the show, some of them still found a way into our hearts, and this moment during Punk Hazard perfectly showed this. You see, near the end of his arc, Caesar wanted to get rid of all the intruders, so he released a toxic gas that froze anyone who inhaled it. Tashigi and her Marine squad found themselves stuck in the building, where the toxic gas was quickly moving toward them. Their only way out was through the building's entrance gate, which immediately started closing. So, the G5 Marines quickly realized that if they all tried to get out, they would all end up dying. With seemingly no way out, they decided to make a heroic decision and sacrifice themselves in order to save Tashigi, their captain. So, a few of them lifted her up and threw her through the gate, while the soldiers on the other side prevented her from going back. And the moment that cemented this as one of the saddest scenes in One Piece was when we got to see that the frozen Marines died with smiles on their faces, giving a huge thumbs up to their captain. Before we cover what might be the actual saddest and most tragic story in One Piece, let's first quickly go over Dressrosa. Dressrosa is another one of those arcs where the saddest moment actually happened during a flashback rather than the actual arc. It all started with Doflamingo taking in a terminally ill boy named Law. Doflamingo's brother, Rocinante, who was actually an undercover Marine, didn't like Law at first, but when he learned about his illness, he felt sorry for the kid and decided to help him. So he took the boy under his wing and tried to find the cure for his illness. However, no matter how many doctors he visited, they all told him the same thing: Law couldn't be cured. Just when all hope was lost, Rocinante found out about the Ope Ope no Mi, a legendary fruit that could potentially heal the boy. So, Rocinante risked everything and infiltrated a pirate base to successfully steal the fruit. However, everything started going downhill from there. You see, during this raid, Rocinante was heavily wounded and had barely managed to make his way back to Law to feed him the fruit. He then handed Law a secret letter and instructed the boy to give it to any nearby Marines so they could save them. However, in a twisted turn of events, Law ended up handing the letter to Virgo, who was one of Doflamingo's officers pretending to be a Marine. This was when Virgo learned about Rocinante and Law's betrayal and started brutally attacking them. Somehow, Rocinante managed to escape with Law. Knowing that Doflamingo would soon catch up to them, Rocinante decided to hide Law in a treasure chest and used his calm fruit around it to make sure nobody heard him. He then smiled at Law, saying that he would die with a smile and hoped that once he was gone, Law would remember him with that exact smile. Doflamingo then arrived to finally end his brother. Although Law cried and screamed from inside the chest, nobody could hear him because of the barrier Rocinante placed. As Doflamingo started mercilessly shooting his brother, Rocinante managed to keep his fruit active in his final moments, all in the hopes of saving Law. Egghead Island. And finally, we arrived at Egghead, the arc that had possibly the most hard-hitting moment in all of One Piece. You see, Kuma had always been a tragic character. When he was just 4 years old, he and his family were captured by the world nobles and became slaves. As a slave, every day was painful for Kuma, but things got even worse after his mother died. From that moment on, 𝐿 completely gave up on life and wanted nothing more than to die as well. However, his father gave him hope by recounting the legends of Nika, a legendary warrior from the past who would free all the slaves. But one day, a guard saw his father dancing just to make 𝐿 smile, and without hesitation, he shot him dead, his blood splattering across 𝐿's face. Afterward, 𝐿 lost the will to live once again, but then came hope. 𝐿 met Ivankov and Ginny, two slaves who had a plan to escape. So, 𝐿 followed them and was able to successfully escape after eating the pawpaw fruit during the God Valley incident. After escaping, 𝐿 was finally free, so he decided to make a home with Ginny and live a happy life. 𝐿 even became a pastor around this time and helped everyone in the village using his devil fruit. He and Ginny also joined the Revolutionary Army in hopes of helping even more people. For a moment, 𝐿 was finally happy, but fate had other plans. You see, 𝐿 soon learned that Ginny had been kidnapped and taken to Marioa to become the wife of a world noble. Despite doing everything in his power to find and rescue her, 𝐿 was unable to do it. However, 2 years later, the Revolutionary Army finally heard from Ginny, and she explained how she had been kicked out of Marioa after getting an incurable disease. But that wasn't all, because she also had a daughter while she was imprisoned, a girl she named Bonnie. Hearing this message, 𝐿 immediately rushed to get to Ginny, but in doing so, he failed to hear the last part of her message, which was that she loved him. By the time 𝐿 arrived, Ginny had already died from her disease after carrying her baby all the way to their village. Despite Bonnie not being his own blood, 𝐿 still took in the young girl and decided to raise her like his own daughter. 𝐿 was happy with Bonnie and he truly cherished her, but that happiness would soon be cut short when Bonnie contracted the same disease as her mother. 𝐿 tried to save her, but the doctors told him that it was an incurable disease and that Bonnie would die before turning 10 years old. This didn't deter 𝐿 though, and he continued his search for the cure until eventually meeting Dr. Vegapunk. The world government agreed to help, but under one condition. 𝐿 had to completely give up his body and mind and become their puppet. Without thinking twice, 𝐿 immediately accepted, grateful that he could finally save his daughter. But before his memories were erased, 𝐿 made one final request. He asked Vegapunk that if Bonnie were to ever meet him again in the future, he should wish her a happy 10th birthday on his behalf.